Hello, everyone, and welcome to the new webinar series, Where Do We Go From Here? Conversations about Community, Resistance, and Creativity, presented by Broadleaf Books, Portrait Press, and Beaming Books. I'm Karen Walrond, the author of The Lightmaker's Manifesto, How to Work for Change Without Losing Your Joy, Radiant Rebellion, Reclaim Aging, Practice Joy, and Raise a Little Hell, and my new book coming in September 2025, In Defense of Dabbling, The Brilliance of Being a Total Amateur. And I'm your host for today's conversation. And I am absolutely thrilled to be here because today we're going to be discussing how creativity nourishes us, our communities, and our activism. It's a really timely topic because many of us are struggling with the balance of staying engaged in the needs of our communities while also protecting our spirits and the spirits of those we love. Joining me today in conversation is a talented and soulful group of authors. First, we have Mary W. McCampbell. She's the author of Imagining Our Neighbors as Ourselves, How Art Shapes Empathy. Mary is a college professor and lives in Tennessee. Welcome, Mary.
Hello, so excited to be here.
I'm thrilled for you to be joining us. Joining us next is Mitali Perkins, whose latest book is Just Making, a guide for compassionate creatives. Mitali is an award-winning author of novels and picture books for young readers, and her books for adults center on the creative experience. Born in India and lived all over the world, Mitali currently resides and writes in the San Francisco Bay Area. Welcome, Mitali.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Namaste to everybody. It's good to see you.
Good to see you as well. And finally, joining our conversation is Anthony B. Pinn, whose latest book is My Jams, Reflections on the Relationship Between Music and Religion. Tony works at the intersection of African American religion, constructive theology, and humanist thought. He teaches at Rice University and lives right here in Houston. Welcome, Tony.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
I'm glad you're all here. I'm so excited about this conversation, and we're just going to jump right in because we have so much to cover. Mitali, I'm going to start with you because by the way, I've read all of these books for those of you who are listening, and they are wonderful, wonderful, wonderful works. And Mitali, in your book, you mention that the creation of art can be for the benefit of the maker and the receiver and the community, which I really love because I don't think I'd ever really thought of art as being for all three of those genres. So can you say a little bit more about that?
Sure. Yeah, I think we tend to maybe focus one more on the other. And I think keeping all three in balance is so essential for each creative person. So when it comes to justice, I define it sort of as that idea of shalom, of human flourishing. And when it comes to us as makers, I don't have to convince you all that there's so much that the work of making can do for us. It can give us a venue for voice. It can help us to express our emotions. There's so much. I in my book I talk about quilting. In my book I do focus a lot on people who keep making despite the odds. People on the margins who don't have access to markets, especially women in parts of the world where I've lived. Like my great-grandmother, who continued to crochet and knit and sew, even though she had no access to traditional routes of power. So in that, when I think about quilting, for example, and all those generations and around the world of usually women who quilt, so much happens in that time. It's a communal gathering. It's a chance to share your stories, and that idea of expressing our trauma and our wounds through the making of art for the maker. And then, of course, in the receiver end, we get this ability, if an artist is willing to be as courageous and vulnerable as we can, then I think on the receiving end, there is that depth of being seen. And I talk about that practice of that loving gaze that art can do, where you see something, whether it be a story, a poem, a song, a sculpture, where you feel so seen by that. I remember walking gardens in Grand Rapids, and there was the statue of Eve by Rodin, and it is such a hard statue to see when you're suffering because she's positioned in such a vulnerable way. She's hiding herself as much as she can, but she's so exposed. And that was a particularly painful time in my life. And I remember walking by, and then I made myself look, and there was something about that statue and the expression of both her desire to be seen and hide that just spoke to my heart in a way that was beautiful. And then, of course, when it comes to the community, I know Mary and Tony will speak to this as well. What art can do is it can transmit truth. It can confront injustice. And I look to the brave artists who are currently in certain countries, are especially women, when they speak out in countries like Afghanistan or Iran. The cost to them is huge when it comes to pushback. Some of them disappear and we don't know where they are. And so I look to them for the courage it takes to confront injustice, speak out against oppression, to transmit truth for this generation and this time. That's what we have to do as a collective of artists.
Oh my gosh, I love this so much. And I love your phrase, the loving gaze. I think that's really, I think, when you feel that, when you really know that you're looking at something very, very special. And I think it's sort of, it touches on, Mary, what you write about, right? Like when we talk about the maker and the receiver and the loving gaze, many would say right now that creating art requires the ability to sort of both empathize and inspire that kind of empathy. And I just wrote about this recently. Right now, empathy is kind of got a dirty word among some parts of the community, which is, I find so shocking, because everything that I ever base my work on is on empathy. But right now, especially in some conservative circles, we see empathy as a weakness and even considered a sin. There are books that are currently coming out that are saying that empathy is a sin, which sort of blew my mind. So I want to talk about this with you because you maintain the opposite, and you argue that art can actually shape empathy. So can you talk a little bit about that? How does art help people develop empathy? And also, just to be clear, why is that a good thing?
Yeah. Such a good and important question. I want to start with just thinking of, the philosopher Simone Weil, who, when she talks about the parable of the Good Samaritan, talks about how attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. And I think that's really incredibly helpful. I was just looking at both Simone Weil and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. talking about, the parable of the Good Samaritan, and MLK also talking about how we typically have this very myopic way of looking at, quote, the other, whether they're the oppressed or the oppressor, and kind of putting these categories on them. Whereas if we take the time to engage in stories of those who are obviously quite different than us, there's something of self-sacrifice to that prolonged, sustained attentiveness. And there is an incredible generosity to it. And Vade, if you haven't read it before, look it up. Her writing on the Good Samaritan parable, the way she talks about that, this kind of self-surrender that it takes to be attentive to the other is actually a creative act. It is a kind of art making in of itself, which I think is fascinating. But it also relates this to the importance of the imagination. And then if we're going to love our neighbor as ourselves, we have to employ the imagination.
That's not easy always. No. Not only, I think, because of like you mentioned, the oppressor and the oppressed. Like for me personally, it's very easy for me to use imagination and use empathy in viewing the oppressed. But in viewing the oppressor, yes. I'd like to say I'm that good, but that's hard, right? Like,
I think the hardest part of the Christian gospel is the love your enemy part, or that's the hardest. And it's what does that look like? What does that actually mean? And that empathy of seeing the humanity and the other, and especially if I'm finding it a struggle myself. How do you show empathy and have empathy for those that show no empathy?
And art, you think, is a way to get to that? Like,
yes, to get
more about that.
To see the complexity of the other person, to really, I guess, see the connectedness, to see similar desires, longings, pains, just to see the humanity, or I'd call from a Christian perspective, the imago Dei in the other, that there still is some sort of there still is a dignity in that other person, as much as marred as it is. And maybe even to understand why. I mean, we're seeing a lot right now of people getting very caught up and consumed by false and hateful narratives. But what is the reason why? What's behind that? And it does take time and self-sacrifice to try to even investigate that, or to be attentive. Again, I'm not saying I'm great at it all the time. And there are times when you have to protect yourself from that because it's too much, because you don't want to be trampled on, right? But yeah.
Absolutely. I love that. Thank you so much. Tony, I talked, we had the opportunity to meet each other before we got together today. And there was a quote in your book that I loved, and I'm sorry, but I am totally moved to share it with everybody here because it really resonated with me. And I think it talks a little bit about community, right? You and I had not met before I read this, but the passage is, in many of these homes, the record player's place was as central and assumed as that of the family Bible, and just as guarded from foolishness and disrespect. And the reason I think I love that so much is, like, our backgrounds are I'm from the Caribbean, our backgrounds are different, but I immediately went back to my childhood, right? And the idea of that passage and of music really suddenly creating a community even with our very disparate backgrounds, just that recognition, that loving gaze, right? That sort of recognition in ourselves. And so I know you talk mostly about music, and you also talk a little bit about religion. So can you talk a little bit about how music galvanizes community, and does it do it in the same way that religion can? Does it do it in a different way, in a better way? Like, talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, Karen, thanks for that question. It seems to me that human life is animated by a set of perplexing questions. Who are we? What are we? When are we? Why are we? And that we wrestle with these questions. We wrestle with them intentionally. We also wrestle with them implicitly. But there are limitations to the tools that we make use of in wrestling with these questions. And one of the tools we make use of that is quite limited is language. And so it seems to me, whether one is talking about sure enough theistic oriented activities and sacred texts that are wrestling with these and trying to kind of imaginatively make use of language, or the arts, it seems to me we're still wrestling with these sorts of questions. One of the things I find really compelling about the arts is the poetic quality. And by poetic, I mean that within the context of the arts, you have a destruction of language in order to free it to tell alternate stories.
Wow.
And so it seems to me, whether one is talking about music or the arts in more general terms, or thinking of in more traditional ways about religion, we have a kind of wrestling with these fundamental questions in a way that is meant to free language to tell alternate stories. I think there is overlap there in terms of how religion at its best and the arts at their best are about the business of kind of freeing us to tell these stories, a kind of reworking of space in a way that is intentional. So I'm not one who talks in terms of spirituality, but I talk in terms of intentionality, a kind of animated intentionality, a kind of conscious manipulation of time and space. And I think it's music that kind of calls us into this alternate understanding of space. And I find that deeply, deeply moving. And again, I think there's overlap between what we traditionally understand as religion and these other ways of wrestling with these fundamental questions of human existence. I'm always brought back to Ralph Ellison's reflection on musicians as he was growing up. And at one point he says that musicians wore their instruments the way a priest wears a cross.
Oh, wow.
And so for me, it kind of pulls this together. And music, again, calling us to creativity, urging us to appreciate imagination within the context of a social world that demonizes imagination and celebrates conformity, that it allows us alternate ways of wrestling with these questions that are so fundamental to how we touch the world and how we are touched by the world.
It's you. I'm going from memory here from your book, but I think you said at one point pretty early on, and tell me if I misquote you. It was something like, "Where there is music, there is life," or and I guess that's true actually of all art, really, right? Like where there is art, there is life, and the idea of that sort of art transcending language, as you say, and sort of being able to kind of connect us all, inspiring empathy, inspiring that loving gaze, inspiring community. That's really, really pretty powerful. And I don't know, as someone who's very late to calling myself an artist, even though I've been a photographer for 30 years and I've been a writer now for however long, I'm very, very late. And even now, sort of calling myself an artist feels a little bit strange because my education wasn't in art, right? My education was in engineering and in law. So that the idea of all of us sort of tapping in on that inner artist in a way that we can inspire that empathy through community and through speaking with each other. I love this. And I think what's interesting is all three of you come at it from a different perspective and yet meet, right? Sort of at the same place. So I love that. Mitali, one of the things that we hear a lot about people is that staying engaged in the world can be really, really tough. And they need to protect themselves. And so I'd love to talk to you a little bit about what role creativity can play in building emotional resistance. One thing that I hear all the time, because I talk a lot and I write a lot about joy and about how I believe that joy is a fundamental pillar of activism, of change, of being able to create longevity in the work. And so what I'd love to hear from you and anybody else, please jump in, but I'll start with you, Mitali. How does creativity help with that? Is it selfish when there's so much pain and suffering that's happening in the world to focus on our art or our craft? Talk a little bit about that.
Well, I have the great advantage that most of my work is targeted toward children. I write for children. And so, if you ask that question to children, how many of you are artists? And they're kindergartners, every single hand will go up, right? They know that they make, and they're so proud of it. And then something happens when you get to a crowd of adults, very few hands will go up because there's sort of this shame creeps in, and there's that joy of creativity that we lose as part of our and again, what Mary was talking about, that idea of children, empathy really is and the loving gaze is really a language learned in childhood best. That's when you get that fluency, right? Think of learning a language in childhood. Your mouth shapes the accents. You keep the turns of phrase. Whenever you learn something as a child, you keep it for a lifetime. And it's the same thing with whether you're crossing borders of power, or you're making relationships with the other, or you're reading fiction across borders and consuming different kinds of songs as a child. As Tony was talking, I was remembering lifting the record needle so that you wouldn't scratch the. We did that as three young immigrant girls. We'd gather around, and that was so crucial not to scratch that album, right? So just even the visceral part of that came to mind, and those were all learned as children, right? So I think that's part of it. Is when Jesus says, if you want to be the greatest of these, you should become like this little one that he embraces and takes into his very, people are trying to hold them back. And he says, nope, let them come, because there's something that we can absolutely learn from children. I think two ways that creativity builds resilience to allow us to do the kind of justice I was talking about, because that's a calling, right? It's not a calling to shirk away from the world. It's a particular portal through which we walk to serve the world, to engage the atrocities and to confront the oppressor. It's through art. And we have to first believe that in our core, because there's pushback. There's both pushback from, marketplace, and there's pushback internally. And so we have to have that conviction that what we're doing is of incredible value. The conviction of children saying, yes, I am an artist. This is the portal through which I will walk into the world, and I'm not going to let anything deter me from that. Now, am I going to make a bunch of money about it? That's another story. We'll talk about that, sure. But I want that conviction first and foremost that as a child, I am an artist, and this is an important thing to the heart of God in the way that I'm called to serve the planet, right? So that conviction first, and then Secondly, I think what it does for us is we have to have that combination of courage to face the intensity of our emotional reaction to what's going on in the world. I mean, if we don't enter into our own suffering and the suffering of others, if we numb our pain, if we, I talk about gluttony in the way that as a vice in my book, and gluttony being whatever we do to numb our pain, right? So we don't face that incredible reaction that we have when we see someone suffering or ourselves. We have to have the courage to confront that without too much numbing. And yet we also have to have the care it takes to not be destroyed by that, right? In both ways, our making can help that, because what making does for me, I don't know about you and Mary and Tony and Karen, but when you start to make, and what happens is you get this idea of flow, right? And it releases you from the relentless passage. Like Gerard Manley Hopkins has that poem, generations have trod. That relentless passage of historical time in which we're caught up with the events of today and we're demoralized by them. What flow does is it takes us out of chronological time and puts us in this eternal time, this beautiful, all of us have experienced, as a child does. You're making something, you look up, oh my goodness, 3 hours have passed. Happened, right? And it's that escape from the chronological pressure that allows us to confront our vulnerability, the conviction of knowing this is the way to serve the world, that will carry us to making making the best art that we can make. Not maybe when all of us won't make great art, but we will maybe push toward the particular good art that each of us has the capacity to make.
I love that.
Can I just add a word?
Please, yes.
That was fantastic, and it inspires a variety of thoughts. And it seems to me, whether one is looking at a Jackson Pollock painting or listening to Alice Walker talk in terms of her connection to the world, right? That if she cuts a tree, her arm will bleed, or listening to Nina Simone, there's something about the arts that pulls us through ourselves to the other. And it seems to me that the arts in this respect offer us a profound opportunity to approach the world through a different question. Who have we forgotten? What have we forgotten? And it seems to me that kind of question of necessity demands some attention to the other in form of community.
I love that. I love that.
Can I go?
Mary, yeah, please.
I'm sorry, to the and relating all this to the joy, what you said about joy. I'm just thinking about joy being subversive, and how the coupling of the importance of holding together joy and lament, and how both of those are so subversive in the sort of, with the sort of status quo empire mentality, that to actually express that to actually, by creating something that's full of joy or full of sadness, or holding the two together, is to continually, emphasize that things are not right and they need to change. And I was just thinking about that, because I just, my last class today that I just taught, we were reading a letter from a Birmingham jail, and I played the clip. I don't know if y'all have seen it. That's appeared on YouTube, of Mahalia Jackson when MLK is getting ready to preach in Chicago. Mahalia Jackson just starts singing, and the just eruption of joy in that space. And I'm telling this to a classroom full of college students. I said, can you imagine that much joy in the midst of such pain and suffering? And of course, we've talked a lot about the spirituals, and about, I cannot think of a better example of holding joy and lament together, and the full humanity of that. And the way Cornel West says, this moaning that I think he says is an arsenal that protected, a Black arsenal that protected so many from suicide or insanity. The holding on to, expressing this moan that contains both, an utterance that can't be completely clearly communicated in human terms, because it's beyond that in both pain and in joy. And I don't know, there's just something so deeply human and deeply beyond human about those things together, I think.
As you guys are speaking about this, I'm remembering an activist who I interviewed in the Lightmakers Manifesto. Her name is Valerie Kaur, and she's Sikh American, S-I-K-H American, and she's a lawyer and a faith leader and an activist, primarily focused on sort of immigrants' rights and anti-bigotry, that kind of thing. And one of the things she told me, I found both depressing and freeing. And what she said was, Karen, whatever it is that we're activated around, whatever it can be, we're probably not going to see it solved in our lifetime. She said, like the environment's not going to be healed, bigotry is not going to go away, poverty is not going to be gone within our lifetime. And that was sort of the depressing part. But she said, so our job isn't to solve it. Our job is actually to take the torch from the people who came before us and carry it as far and as long as we can and hand it off to the people who come after us. And the only way we can build that longevity in the work is by being tethered to joy, right? Is by being able to using joy as a reminder of why we fight, and using joy as a way of gathering the energy to go back into fight. And I found that such a, it really sort of shifted my whole outlook on what does it mean to be activated and to be an activist in the world, and how joy really is a pillar of being able to do that. So a question that I'm gonna throw this to everybody, and it's yes, go ahead, Mitali.
I just quickly add in the word mirth, M-I-R-T-H, and just put a plug in for a good laugh as part of self-care. I think there were moments where there have been some really shocking things that have been happening recently, and we're all sort of collectively waiting to see how Saturday Night Live will process it.
Or The Onion, or any of this.
Somebody who's an improv comedian or so. And I think that's the difference between what I'm trying to get at is that not all art that brings joy has to be this great, deep, profound art. It can be light and airy and funny. And I love the role of the humor plays. I've been going to this chiropractor, this teeny tiny guy, and he's an okay chiropractor. But the best thing is that we laugh, like we have that contagious laugh together. And so I leave feeling healed more by the laughter than by the chiropractic. And I think I would put a plug in for just finding like lighter art, maybe to receive not just heavy, profound art that reflects the trauma of our age, but also art that will lift us up into the laughter of children, the way that children laugh at themselves, at each other, at silliness, at this buoyancy that laughter brings us.
Absolutely.
That's a really important point, that I think we fixate on grand gestures of resistance and lose sight of the ways in which the ordinary also constitutes resistance, right? In the context of a death-dealing social world, laughter is a form of resistance.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Absolutely.
That's exactly right. And I think the funniest people are people who've come from marginalized situations. I remember my great-grandmother, who, again, as I said, was married off at age 9 in an arranged marriage, had no voice. She was hilarious. She would make us all laugh so hard. And I think it was such a gift that she had that humor that was able to carry her through. So yeah, I think it is definitely a way of resistance. It's subversive to be able to laugh in the face of chaos and tyranny and oppression, to be able to say, ha, look, there's a child laughing. I'm going to laugh with that child, and nothing's going to stop us. Nobody can stop that, right?
I love it.
That's certainly one way to understand the blues or Black folk wisdom.
Right, right. And so this is a great segue, because I want to talk a little bit about art as self-care, right? And being able to be tethered to joy, and to be able to be tethered to the light. And then using art as your resistance, right? And I think that some people can get I know I've wrestled with this, like how much of the art that I do, or the forms of art do I do just for me because I need it to be able to deal with the world? And how much of my art do I do to actually have a statement to people, actually be a part of the resistance? And does that make one form of art better than the other? I'd love your thoughts on that. Anybody?
Well, I mean, I'll do a quick start with that. I have a whole chapter. I have these 10 tips to keep making in my book, and one of them is to liberate the art. That for me is, as I'm getting older as a maker, I used to want to have this like message of justice that I want kids to leave my story from. And I want them to be so aware that, and once I began to let that go, first I let it go with picture books because the illustrator shares half the story, right? I had to let all the control of my message, the didactic part of it go. What I began to realize that once you've lived some time, and have actually crossed borders in real life. Someone once said, if you want to do works of justice, shut up, cross a border and hold a bunch of babies for a while, and then maybe come back and tell a story about that what's happening on the other side of the border, right? Because when we start with the best intentions and we start with our beliefs and our philosophies and our strong philosophical or political or religious convictions, it does not liberate the art. So we have to, again, have that conviction that if we've crossed borders in our own lives, if we've done works of justice with our hands, with our actual bodies, that will be in our bones, in our cells as we create, and that we don't have to control the art. So I think I'm more about liberating the art now and seeing in the mess of the page what is coming from here and here rather than here. So
yeah.
I'm not convinced that there's a significant distinction between the two.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So I would think about it this way, that we are individuals within the context of others, that we are already and always in relationship, right? And so to care for self, it seems to me on some level, is to recognize the significance of the other. And so again, I wouldn't make such a clear distinction between the two. I'm just not convinced that is necessary. For me, it's premised upon the assumption that boundaries and borders are meaningful when they are simply imagined and enforced. Right. But I think I think collective life is really premised upon the kind of porous and open nature of engagement. And so I think for me, it requires a different orientation, that we are already and always in relationship. And so taking care of myself isn't to detangle from relationship. It's simply another way of engaging and enlivening relationship.
I love that. All right, so I'm gonna bring up a dirty word here because I love that idea, and I love the idea of creating art and that we are always in relationship. So if we are creating it, it can be our resistance voice, it can be our self-care voice, whatever it is. But I'm going to talk about that dirty thing called money, and Mitali alluded to a bit about market. Like when we decide to create art, and Mary, I'm gonna ask you this question. When we decide to create art as a way to make a living, does that somehow bankrupt all the things that we've been talking about here, including empathy, right? When money becomes a focus.
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky. You know, I have students right now writing, some of them choose to writing papers about how in the music, I'm sorry, I keep talking about music, Tony. I'm sorry. But they're just talking about this new, crop up of artists who are not connected to record labels, but they're producing directly, on social media. And that's a really interesting thing to think about. Does it have more authenticity? And they're not having to kind of standardize their music. But there's a quote that I love, an idea that I love from a man named Ellis Potter. I met from L'Abri Fellowship years ago, who talks about how, thinking about art as not as a commodity, but as a conversation. And that gets into that relationality and reflexiveness. And does putting money in the way, but I think that I would say, monetizing something. Well, I'm just thinking about, my job as a professor and how much I love teaching, and it's almost feels like an art form to me.
Sure.
But to get paid for it, it's sort of a dream come true to be able to do that, right? And so I think that it depends on what your focus is. I mean, we have to survive, and there is a sense of you know, showing some connection to the other in a sense of, I value this, so I will pay for it because this means something to me. And I'm entering in that conversation. It's a way of almost sacrificially entering into the conversation. I'm putting some money over in this. But I mean, I think this is a very hard question. I'm thinking about from the point of view of the artist, you do have to be careful to how far do you go with thinking about, do you conform your art to certain standards because that'll make you more money, or do you stay true to your actual vision? I mean, this is the age-old question. This goes with am I going to go on a record label, or I'm going to be Chance the Rapper? I mean, not everybody, right?
Right.
So I don't know. I didn't really answer it. I'm just thinking about, I mean, it all has to do with your perspective, and are you going to let the money own you as you create, or is it just going to be a way to kind of help sustain you in what you're doing? And we all need that. And I think there are people out there who want to kind of interact on a deeper level with us by paying us. So, yeah.
Any other thoughts?
Chance the Rapper is making bank, right? So Chance the Rapper is doing well. And so it seems to me two things can be true. That I can want my art to sell in a way that generates resource for me. And I can also understand that the system under which we live is problematic because it is premised upon the perpetuation of poverty. Two things can be true.
I think that's absolutely right. Okay, so now I'm thinking of the people who might be watching this who were like me, have a hard time calling themselves an artist, maybe have been fearful of dabbling in any art. So I'm going to go around, I'm going to start, and I'd love for each of us to share a daily or weekly practice that we engage in to help bolster our spirits, especially living with all of this. All right, so I'm going to tell mine. And for me, I will tell you, the book that I have that's coming out, In Defense of Dabbling, is all about sort of experimentation with things that bring you joy, whether or not it's a hobby or an art or whatever. And the thing that I tried a bunch of different things as I wrote this book, but the thing that I did that's stuck is pottery. And this is me being vulnerable, you guys, because this is my mug. This was supposed to be a 12-ounce mug. It holds maybe half a teaspoon of coffee. It's ugly. It's messy. I love this thing so much. And being at the pottery where I have to focus on the clay, be elbow deep in clay and try to create something and block out everything else just for the 2 or 3 hours that I'm in the pottery, that for me is what's giving me life. So that's my thing. Let's start with you, Tony. What is an artistic practice that you do?
I'm a big fan of the book Walden. And there are certain things that Thoreau says in that, things about living intentionally that I find really compelling. So Karen, I don't know where in Houston you live, but I'm not far from Buffalo Bayou.
Oh, yeah.
So one of the things I love to do when weather allows and schedule will cooperate is to walk the bayou.
Nice.
Because on some level, it pulls me into myself, but also pulls me out of myself, right? That it gives me time to just kind of catch my breath and think and kind of appreciate the ways in which I touch the world and ways in which I'm touched by the world.
I love that. That is beautiful. Yes, we're not far from each other. Mitali, how about you? Like, what is an artistic practice that you do just to help bolster your spirit?
Yeah, I think I talked about this idea of seeking mentors in the margins. And one of the things I love to do when I travel or when I receive a gift, let's say made by, especially, I like to think about female hands, brown hands, black hands, in places where they have no access to markets, and yet they make. And if something comes my way that is made by that kind of a person who is, or very old hands, or There, you know, people who, like, I have a friend that I talk about. She was a beautiful oil painter, and then she lost her vision through macular degeneration.
Mhm.
And she's 89 years old now, but she decided that instead of doing the kind of art, she would begin to play with color. And so she can see a little bit of color. She goes out in her garden, puts a huge canvas out there, and she just pours color across this, and it comes right out of her heart. And I saw one of her pieces. It's very large, and I fell in love with it because not only does it express the joy and exuberance that in her face of her grief and loss that she's able to put on the canvas, but she has continued to make,
Mm.
despite losing capacity, she has continued to make beautiful art. So that piece hangs in our entry. I bought it, and I put it, framed it, put it in our entry, and every time I walk by it, I feel Ginny's joy, but I also feel that if she perseveres to make, well, then I'm going to keep going until my last breath
Absolutely.
as well.
I
Yeah.
love that. That's wonderful. And Mary, what about you? Do you have an artistic practice that helps
See,
bring you joy?
I'm kind of like you in the sense that I feel hesitant to even think of myself as an artist,
Sure.
especially because I've been trained as an academic.
Hmm.
And I feel like I'm so cerebral, and I'm sitting there thinking, oh, I need to do pottery. Like, I'm sitting here
You should do pottery.
walk more around ponds. I need to do pottery. But I was just thinking, and I am challenged. I want to do more things like that. But I was thinking about what's a practice that I even do with trying to change my mindset.
Hmm.
Because there's an artist named Douglas Copeland, and he wrote the novel Generation X. And,
Yep.
and there's someone I've gotten to know quite well, a lovely guy. And
Great book.
he talks about how curiosity, and this takes us back to childhood.
Mm.
This takes us back to the faith and the curiosity of a child, and sort of that childlike wonder and that ongoing curiosity. And he basically says any artist who acts like they know everything and have it all together and are cool is a hack, because being an artist is about being continually curious.
Mm.
And connected with that, I would hope to connect that with empathy with other human beings, as I want to be curious about their stories, and maybe even listen to a story of someone that I'm initially, kind of want to distance myself.
Yeah.
And again, being curious about what the imago Dei it looks like in that person,
Yeah.
even when I feel an aversion. So those are some ways that I kind of have thought through things
Yeah.
a lot. But yeah, I need to get a little less cerebral, honestly.
Well, I mean, I love this. I mean, we've talked about like me making with my hands, and walking as a practice, collecting art as a practice, collecting story as a practice. So I mean, I think it's all there. And I could talk to all of you all day long. I hate that we're going to have to cut this short, because we could do this like for hours and hours and hours. So our time is up. Let me just end by thanking all of you so much for your generosity of spirit, your generosity of story, your generosity of thought to this. It's been fantastic. I'm going to be thinking about this for a long time. So thank you guys so much for being here.
Thank you for the conversation.
Yeah, thank you. I've learned so much.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
It.
And for everybody else who has been listening to us, thank you so much for joining us today. If you are registered, you're going to be receiving an email soon with a link to this conversation and other resources, including a link to all of our books. And remember to tune in next week to these same channels for the next episode in this webinar series entitled We Are the Work, Community Organizing for a New Age. Thanks again, everyone. Have a wonderful, wonderful day.
Bye.
Bye.